Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the different types of blood vessels. Arteries are vessels that would carry the blood away from the heart. Veins are blood vessels that carry the blood towards the heart. Capillaries are very thin blood vessels, and this is where exchange between the blood and the interstitial fluid will take place. Exchange of things like gases, hormones, nutrients will be able to exit out of our capillaries and enter into our interstitial fluid. This image right here shows some structural differences between an artery, a vein, and a capillary. There are common things between those three vessels, and there are some major differences. Now, vessels are known to have three different layers, and we refer to those layers as tunica. Tunica actually means a cover. And so most vessels have three layers. The deepest layer would be the tunica intima. Then we have a layer in the middle known as the tunica media, and then the most superficial layer we would refer to it as the tunica externa. Now, capillaries are, as we said earlier, capillaries are known to be very thin. And so therefore capillaries only have the tunica intima. Capillaries are not going to have the tunica media, and they're not going to have the tunica externa. Now the tunica intima, which is the deepest layer, which you can see right here, that would be the tunica intima right there. Both veins and arteries are going to have that tunica intima, and the tunica intima is in direct contact with the blood. So the blood is going to be flowing right through here in that space, hollow cavity known as the lumen. And so therefore it's going to be in direct contact with that tunica intima. The tunica intima contains endothelium layer, which is basically a simple squamous epithelium tissue. And having that endothelial layer is going to help create a slick surface on the inside, and having that slick surface is going to prevent the blood, when it flows through an artery or a vein, it's going to prevent that blood from sticking to the walls. You don't want blood to be sticking to the walls, otherwise over time your vessels are going to become narrower, and the blood flow is going to be affected, and the blood flow is going to slow down. Now, there is this layer right here known as the subendothelial layer. Sub means below, so subendothelial, it's a layer below that endothelial layer. Not all vessels, though, would have the subendothelial layer. You can see that in this image, both arteries and veins have them, but usually the subendothelial layer, which is made out of a loose connective tissue, would only be found in arteries that have larger diameters, usually larger than 1 millimeters. You can also see in this image that there is an elastic membrane. Not all vessels are going to have that elastic membrane. Having that elastic membrane is going to give the vessel more elasticity. Now, why do you see an elastic membrane right here in an artery and it's missing in that vein right there? to explain that, actually, let's take a look at this lumen right here, which is, one more time, that narrow passageway in an artery or in a vein. You would notice that the lumen of an artery, it's much narrower compared to the lumen of a vein. And so the narrower the lumen, the more resistance is going to take place as the blood is running down that vessels, because it's pretty narrow. As the blood is flowing into that lumen, it can actually start kind of bumping into the walls, and so therefore arteries are going to have a higher blood pressure compared to the blood pressure within the veins, because as you can see, the veins have a pretty larger lumen, and so there's going to be less resistance, and so therefore the blood pressure is going to be much lower in the veins compared to in the arteries. And so whenever you're going to have a higher blood pressure, you need to have more elasticity. Think of it as if you have a water hose. If you have a water hose and that water hose starts to get older and it starts losing that elasticity, you would notice that your water hose is going to start cracking and it might burst. And so therefore, arteries are going to have more elastic membranes compared to veins because of the constant higher pressure that they are dealing with. This middle membrane, this middle wall right here, is known as the tunica media. And the tunica media is mostly made out of smooth muscles. And you would also find some elastic fibers within the tunica media. Arteries usually have a much thicker tunica media compared to the tunica media of the veins. And having a thicker tunica media, one more time, contributes to a narrower lumen within the arteries compared to the veins. Having that smooth, that layer of smooth muscle is going to help with the idea of vasoconstriction and dilation. When those smooth muscles contract, they can actually narrow the blood vessels, and when they relax, they can actually dilate those blood vessels. One more time, arteries are usually going to have another elastic membrane behind that tunica media before you hit that tunica externa on the outside. Now, the tunica externa, it's mostly made out of collagen fibers and some elastic fibers as well. And because the collagen fibers are going to give strength to that outside wall, but because that tunica externa, it's pretty far away from the blood running down the vessel, the tunica externa is going to have a hard time getting nutrients because it's pretty far away from that blood. So how can the tunica externa stay alive? It needs its own set of blood vessels. So the tunica externa, which is the wall of a blood vessel, actually needs its own blood vessels. And so we call those tiny blood vessels, and you can see them right here, those blue and red dots, those are known as the vasa vasorum, which actually means vessel of the vessels. And they're there to basically supply the tunica externa with the nutrition it needs. Arteries and veins are connected to each other via a network of capillaries. And so that's why the blood flow is going to be able to move directly from an artery into a vein and vice versa, and you're not going to have any interruption between the flow that's going from an artery to a vein and vice versa. Capillaries are pretty thin and they're only going to be made out of that tunica intima. And you can see right here that layer of the simple squamous epithelium tissue. That basement membrane, it's not made out of cells. The basement membrane, it's usually made out of things like fibers and proteins. And the idea behind having a basement membrane is that basement membrane is going to act as a restrictive layer on top of the capillary. As I said, capillaries are pretty thin, and so this is where the exchange is going to take place. And so the basement membrane kind of puts a restriction on that capillary, preventing certain things from passing out of the capillary. One more thing to mention about this picture before we move on is that if you take a look at the vein right here, as we said, the veins have a larger lumen, and so therefore there's going to be less resistance with the blood flow, and so therefore the blood pressure in the veins are going to be much lower. If we talk about the blood flow through the veins, we said that veins would carry the blood towards the heart. And so if you are talking about the veins, let's say in your legs, the veins in your legs would have to take the blood from your legs and it would have to send that blood all the way up to the heart. And so the blood is actually going to have to move against gravity, right? Because it's going from your legs all the way up to your heart. And the pressure in the veins are pretty low. And so therefore, the blood is going to have a hard time moving all the way from your legs to your heart. And so to help, prevent any blood backflow, because you don't want the blood to start going backwards and going back to your legs when you want to make them actually, when you want to make your blood reach your heart. And so to prevent that backflow, usually the veins in your legs would have these foldings right here. They're actually foldings of the tunica intima known as the valves. They act as the valves in your heart. So in your heart, we also have those valves that prevent the backflow of blood. And so those valves in your lower veins in your legs are actually going to prevent the blood from going backwards so that the blood would be pushed in one direction upwards towards your heart. This image right here shows how arteries have a narrower lumen compared to a vein. And the reason why arteries have a narrower lumen because they have a much thicker tunica media compared to veins. Veins would have a much thicker tunica externa compared to the arteries. And because arteries have a narrower lumen, the blood pressure is going to be much higher in an artery compared to a vein. This image right here shows that the closer we get to the heart, the larger the vessels will be in size. The further away we move from the heart, the smaller their size will be because the pressure further away from the heart is going to be much lower compared to the pressure closer to the heart. The arteries that are directly connected to the heart, we refer to those as elastic arteries because they will have a high level of elasticity. Those would be the aorta and its main branches, and the pressure in the aorta when the left ventricle pumps that blood out into the aorta is going to be pretty high, and that's why it's important for the aorta to actually have lots of elasticity. Otherwise, if the aorta starts losing that elasticity, the aorta might burst. The further away we go from the heart and that aorta eventually is going to start branching out, we start calling those arteries the muscular arteries or distributing arteries, because they're going to start distributing the blood to the different organ systems in our body. Those muscular arteries, they usually have a thick layer of the tunica media, which is made out of the smooth muscles. So they are going to be able to constrict and dilate when those smooth muscles basically contract and relax. The further we get away, the arteries get smaller and smaller, and we start referring or we start giving them the name arterioles. Arterioles, even though they're pretty small, they're still going to have the three tunica layers, the intima, the media, and the externa. You're not going to have any interruption in the blood flow, so the blood is going to be able to flow from the arterioles directly into the venous system. The tiny veins that are going to be connected to the capillary beds. So first of all, the capillary beds are what's going to connect your arterial system with the venous system. So right here, the very thin veins that are going to be connected to the capillaries, we refer to them as venules. And eventually those venules are going to merge together, and we're going to start calling them veins, and those veins, they keep merging, and as you can see, the size gets larger and larger, so that you would have pretty large veins connected to the heart directly, such as the superior and inferior vena cava, because one more time, as we get closer to the heart, the pressure is going to start to increase. But you're still going to have a higher blood pressure in the arteries compared to the veins. Now, this image is just showing you how when you look at those elastic arteries versus the muscular versus the arterial, their composition is going to be different. So elastic arteries are going to have a pretty good amount of elasticity within them, so their elastic tissue is going to be much higher compared to the other set of arteries we have. And so the composition or the structure wise of the arteries might vary depending on which artery you're talking about and depending on their location. Are they closer to the heart? Are they further away from the heart? Etc.